I'm Allison Stanger. I'm director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of the International Studies Colloquium. Very dramatic ringtone there.
You didn't have theme music when I was a student.
We've moved forward since that time. Great progress here. Sorry about some of the delays at the door. We have way more people interested in attending this event than we could accommodate, and we've had issues with the fire code, so we have to be very careful about just letting people in. So thank you for your patience as we sorted out those procedures. A number of you are familiar faces, but for anybody new to us, the drill is very simple. Lunch is served throughout the program. We conclude promptly at 1:30. For those of you students out there, we'll break shortly, and then we will reconvene as a smaller group for a career conversation. That's a chance to ask our guest anything you want about his career path and his time at Middlebury, things that might not seem appropriate in this larger setting. So please join us. We'd love to see you there. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Robert Schlesinger back to Middlebury College. He's my former advisee and a former student who's gone on to do great things. I know there are some other professors in the audience who have taught Rob, and also some that, you know, were a bit tardy in RSVPing and so can't be here today. But everybody is very excited to have him here. Robert Schlesinger is an outstanding member of the class of 1994. He's currently a deputy editor of U.S. News and World Report, where he oversees all opinion editorial content for usnews.com. Rob is also the author of a very popular book recently released, White House Ghosts, Presidents and Their Speechwriters. As some of you may have noticed, we have those books available for sale if you'd like. You could have them signed afterwards if that's of interest to you. But I think Rob distinguished himself among all of my former students. I think he's my first former student to appear on the Jon Stewart Show. So congratulations to you, Rob. It's all up on the web if you want to check it out. Rob came to U.S. News and World Report as a freelancer and blogger for a variety of publications, including Salon.com, TheEconomist.com, The Huffington Post, and the New York Times Magazine. His work has appeared in a range of different publications, everything from the Washington Monthly to the Weekly Standard, to People magazine, which I like, and also the Boston Globe magazine. Prior to joining U.S. News, Rob covered national security and public policy issues for the Boston Globe's Washington Bureau. He currently teaches graduate-level political journalism at the Boston University Washington Journalism Center. His former professors are all very proud of him, even those who were shut out from today's event. But nothing is more pleasing to a teacher than to see a former student draw a crowd, especially when it's for something they have written that is neither incendiary nor obscene. So this is a wonderful occasion.
Are you sure you've read the book through?
It didn't seem obscene to me, but Rob will speak today on the topic of his book, White House Ghosts, Presidents and Their Speechwriters. Please join me in welcoming Robert Schlesinger back to Middlebury College.
Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Allison, for arranging this. It's taken 15 years, give or take, but I think I can finally call her Allison instead of Professor Stanger. It's funny, I'm actually a little bit much more nervous than I expected to be, so you'll have to bear with me. It's such a great honor to be back here at Middlebury. As Allison mentioned, I now work at U.S. News and World Report, which, as I'm sure many in the room could tell you, ranked Middlebury 5th this year, which was the same as last year, so I'm sorry I haven't been able to get us moved up yet. But on the other hand, I can happily report that I haven't managed to get us moved down yet either. So I should note that as opinion editor at U.S. News, I get to solicit a number of op-eds and commentaries. I published one recently by one John McCardle, who's here, calling for the lowering of the drinking age, which was a position that I can assure you that my classmates and I would have found rather astounding 15 years ago. One I think was correct, by the way. I've been telling people that my classmate Hardy Merrill of '94 is here, and others of our ilk are probably responsible for his seeing the virtue of a lower drinking age. The last time I appeared in front of a crowd this big at Middlebury College was when I was a student here. I was on stage introducing the gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson. Someone had foolishly put me in charge of the student lecture series, and I squandered the entire budget on bringing Thompson to campus, much to the irritation of John McCardle and the dean of the students and people at Old Chapel.
I enjoyed it, Ron.
Yeah, already like that. I had a great time, but you can imagine their reaction when Thompson's agent sent along a contract writer that required various sorts of food and alcohol be present not only in the green room but on stage with him. I can tell you that the booze didn't make it. He didn't get the booze, and the food looks much better today than what we had then. Anyway, it is a great honor to be back here at Middlebury, so let me just dive right into discussing White House ghosts. The year was 1940. Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House. Work on speeches generally took place after the regular workday, a reflection of the informality that was retained even through the war years. Perhaps a half dozen evenings a month, the writers would gather at the Oval Office while the president mixed drinks and held court. He displayed more enthusiasm as a bartender than skill. His bourbon old-fashions were first-rate, but his martinis with 2 kinds of vermouth and occasionally absinthe were to be avoided. The real work on speeches would commence after dinner. Roosevelt sat on a couch near the fireplace in his office, his feet propped up on a custom-built stool. He often pulled from his pockets little scraps of paper in which he noted down ideas, phrases, or specific points to make in the speech. The president would retire by 11. The speechwriters then retreated to the cabinet room to finish the draft and often another. White House stenographers, security guards, and most importantly, the kitchen quickly became used to the odd hours. These late work nights often involved plates of sandwiches, cups of coffee, bottles of soda, beer, and bourbon. Rosenman drank Coca-Cola and coffee to keep himself up. Sherwood and Hopkins insisted that bourbon had the same effect on them. Rosenman was Judge Samuel Rosenman, who had first met FDR in 1928. Clean-shaven and slightly plump, Rosenman had a fastidious appearance that reflected an ordered mind. He was a neat man, his aide David Ginsburg later told me. He knew where things were and what he wanted. Sherwood was Robert Emmett Sherwood, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, pro-British activist, and bon vivant. And Hopkins was Harry Hopkins, FDR's very close aide, whose reputation for bluntness prompted Winston Churchill to tell him that after the war was over, the British were going to give him a noble title. He would be Lord Root of the Matter. Flash ahead 60-some-odd years. George W. Bush is in his first term in the White House. Speech sessions no longer took place over cocktails in the Oval Office. Instead, if you were a speechwriter working on whose speech the president was going to deliver that day, you'd be expected to be at your desk at 7 a.m. on the morning of the speech, because that would be when the president would call with questions or comments. The speechwriting staff had grown in intervening decades, but at its core was again a trio of writers. A deeply religious man, Michael Gerson, had neatly combed hair and a high forehead and circular glasses that gave him, as one reporter put it, an owl-like appearance. Matthew Scully was a passionate believer in animal welfare, the rare vegetarian, anti-meat, pro-animal conservative who kept a Ziploc bag of peanuts in his office that he would feed to squirrels in the White House lawn. Rounding out the trio was John McConnell, who was a square-jawed Wisconsinite with a flair for original phrasing. Bush called the 3 men the Troika. Instead of late nights in the cabinet room, the 3 would work in McConnell's office, huddled around a computer amid water bottles, coffee-stained papers, and bits of half-eaten sandwiches and other kinds of food. McConnell, who kept a supply of wet ones towelettes in his desk, endured the chaos with good humor. I mention these 2 examples, FDR to Bush, not simply to give bookends to the subject of my book, but to demonstrate that things change and some things stay the same. The position has evolved over the years, and there are similarities and differences. In the next little while, I'd like to briefly touch on 4 of the modern presidents and talk about how they approached speech writing and speech giving. First, why speechwriters? The rise of mass communications has made speech making a critical, central to any effective presidency. Speeches are policy-forcing events. The fact of articulating a policy uncovers weak points and fuzzy logic. If it doesn't work on paper, Richard Nixon used to say, it probably doesn't work at all. So how a president approaches the speech also gives an insight into his leadership style. And few people are as well positioned to get an insight into that insight as are the speechwriters. Presidents since George Washington have had help writing speeches. Washington had Alexander Hamilton and James Madison brush up in his farewell address, which I think probably qualifies him as having the best speechwriting staff of any president. And while Warren Harding had the first full-time speechwriter in the sense that we think of a presidential speechwriter, it was under Franklin Roosevelt that the position really blossomed. FDR, in many ways, had invented a new style of speech-making. For the nation's first 150 years, speeches were designed to be delivered to large, present audiences. Speeches had to be long enough to satisfy people who had traveled long hours to hear them. They were sort of the form of pop entertainment. And at the same time, they had to be delivered in a way that if you were sitting in the back of a large hall or in the back of a crowd, the voice, you could hear the speaker. And so that lent itself to a different kind of delivery than does the microphone or radio. Radio flipped things, and FDR was the first president to grasp, to realize how radio had changed things. Instead of aiming addresses at large present public audiences, a speaker could visit people in the quiet of their own home, and FDR invented a lower-key, more casual style that supplanted the more formal rhetorical stylings that had preceded it. And that lower-key style, more or less, remains in place today. If you think about it, what was FDR would start all of his speeches by saying, "My friends," and what is John McCain's favorite expression, but "my friends." Undergirding FDR's remarkable volume of verbiage was that hallmark of the modern presidency, the speechwriter. FDR was not the first president to employ a speechwriter full-time, but by institutionalizing the position, and he revolutionized both it and presidential communications. And if too often FDR's successors reached for his speaking style, even into the 1970s, presidents talked about trying to give fireside chats. This often reflected a failure to achieve Roosevelt's skill in the hidden processes underlying speeches. His gift was to find people who could capture his voice and, to use a sports metaphor, help him elevate his rhetorical game. And while Roosevelt's talented speechwriters introduced a number of memorable phrases that we remember, whether New Deal, having nothing to fear but fear itself, rendezvous with destiny, to name a few, Roosevelt himself also had a talent for producing memorable lines. He would stop, lean back in his chair, and stare up at the ceiling. Sometimes minutes would pass in silence. Then he would dictate a passage that more often than not remained in the speech as dictated. He sometimes prefaced this by turning to his secretary, Grace Tully, and saying, "Grace, take a law," a reference to a George M. Cohan musical in which during the 100 Days Roosevelt had dictated laws to Congress. Sometimes his dictations would nail the point immediately. At other times he would ramble, eventually losing steam and finally saying breezily, "Well, something along those lines, you boys can fix it up." Sometimes his inserts were never meant for the speech at all, but he knew that his aides would take out whatever he was venting. Sometimes he would disagree with his writers, and they would want to take something out, he would want to leave it in, and he would turn to his secretary and say, mock plaintively, "They won't let me say anything of my own in my own speech." Mostly he would overrule his aides at this time, but sometimes he would tell them they could go ahead and take it out. He would just ad-lib the phrase back in when he gave the speech, and he did. Perhaps the best example of FDR coming up with his own memorable phrasing came on December 7th, 1941. Shortly before 5 p.m., Roosevelt summoned Grace Tully, his secretary, to his study. Reports had been coming in from a smoldering Pearl Harbor all afternoon, and the president finally had a moment to reflect on the speech that he would give to Congress and the nation the next day. Tully found him alone at his desk. 2 or 3 neatly stacked piles of notes were in front of him, and he was lighting a cigarette. "Sit down, Grace," he said. "I'm going before Congress tomorrow. I'd like to dictate my message. It will be brief." He took a long drag on his cigarette. "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history, the United States of America was simultaneously and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, period." Later, going over the draft, Roosevelt made a handful of changes, including scratching out world history and putting in the more memorable infamy. My point here isn't to adjudicate or assign credit to specific people for specific phrases. The credit, I argue, in White House Ghosts, for any presidential speech, has to be with the president. The president is the person who's putting himself and his office on the line, putting his credibility on the line, and so for better or worse, they have to own the speech, even if they didn't originate the specific phrases. The debate about this debate between ownership and authorship most often comes up in connection with John F. Kennedy and his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen. Kennedy met Sorensen in January of 1953 when he was interviewing people for his staff for his new Senate office. Sorensen of Lincoln, Nebraska, was not an obvious match for John F. Kennedy of Hyannisport and Brookline, Massachusetts, and Palm Beach, Florida, and Washington, D.C. JFK was best known for his good looks and the amount of his family's money that had gone into his Senate race. And his liberal credentials were questionable. Sorensen was, as a home state friend later put it, quote, "not a Harvard man or an Easterner or a Catholic or an Irishman or a hereditary Democrat or a political middler or culturally sophisticated or rich or an aristocrat or an urbanite or an intellectual dilettante or widely traveled or weak on the civil liberties side of things or primarily interested in why England slept type of foreign affairs or a master of the Ivy League casual style or anything at all of a playboy. He was instead, insofar as these things have opposites, fairly near the opposite of all of them. Nevertheless, the pair formed a remarkable, if apparently on its face, unlikely team. When I asked Sorensen how he was able to come to know someone with such a different background so well, he pointed to the 3.5 years leading up to the 1960 presidential election when the two men traveled the 50 states together, sharing hotel rooms, sharing airplanes, trains, cars. Those 3.5 years of traveling the country together made an enormous difference, Sorensen said. There were all kinds of press stories, some of them exaggerations, about how I was inside his mind, could finish his sentences, knew what he was going to say before he said it. Well, I think there's something to that. That's a tremendous advantage for a speechwriter to know his boss's mind as well as I did. Their bond was well known around town. When Jack is wounded, Ted bleeds, one observer told the New York Times in 1960. Kennedy himself used a different blood metaphor, describing Sorensen as my intellectual blood bank. They established a speechwriting process that remained consistent in the Senate through the campaign trail and into the White House. Having gotten Kennedy's direction, Sorensen would prepare a first draft. Speeches were not to exceed 20 to 30 minutes, which I think is a pretty good guideline. Words were regarded as tools of precision to be chosen with and applied with a craftsman's care, Sorensen recalled. Soft words and phrases, suggest, perhaps, possible alternatives for consideration, were to be avoided. Short words and clauses were the order, with simplicity and clarity the goal. And while the summoning trumpets of the inaugural address have linked Kennedy in the public mind with flowery prose, he generally shunned rhetorical excess. The inaugural was a special occasion, Sorensen told me, and there was a special tone in that speech. It was more elevated language. Kennedy liked alliteration not simply for reasons of rhetoric, but to reinforce his audience's recollection of his reasoning. His taste for contrapuntal phrasing, never fearing to negotiate, but never negotiating out of fear, was illustrated his dislike of extreme opinions and options. As an editor, Kennedy had an uncertain sense of structure, of spelling, and of grammar. but he had a knack for tightening phraseology and thoughts. In April of 1962, he asked my father, the late historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was an aide in his White House, to prepare remarks for a dinner he was hosting of Western Hemisphere Nobel Prize winners who were being honored at the White House. My father handed in a draft that started by doubting whether the White House had ever seen such a concentration of genius and achievement. Kennedy scribbled on his reading copy, except when Jefferson was here, who combined all. Then Kennedy told the gathering, "This is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." JFK had clear ideas of how and when to use the bully pulpit. Few people recall it, but JFK was skeptical of the power of rhetoric in and of itself. He liked to quote from Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1, where in response to Owen Glendower's boast that he can, quote, call spirits from the vasty deep, Hotspur replies, "Why, so can I, so can any man, but do they come when you do call them?" Kennedy understood that the context had to be correct for a presidential rhetoric to have an effect. He understood that speech-making is a critical tool of a successful president, but it's one of many available to a chief executive, and a president has to be able to use them all. Kennedy also had a flair, as do many of his colleagues, for coming up with original thoughts and phrases himself, and especially for extemporaneous speaking. One of the best examples of this came in Berlin in 1963. Before Kennedy left Washington, his brother Robert had suggested that he say something in German to the West Berliners. As Air Force One crossed a divided Germany towards the tiny western outpost that was Berlin, the president turned to Special Assistant Kenneth O'Donnell and asked, "What was the proud boast of the Romans, civis Romanus sum? Send Bundy up here," Bundy, the national security advisor. "He'll know how to say it in German." Bundy later told the historian Michael Beschloss that Kennedy had no feeling for foreign languages. So there we were on the goddamn plane coming down on Berlin while he repeated the phrase over and over again. And it worked. God, how it worked. At some point, Kennedy scrawled three key phrases on a piece of lined paper, spelling them phonetically so that he'd know how to pronounce them. Ich bin ein Berliner, he wrote, underlining the middle E's in Berliner to emphasize the long E. Civis Romanus sum and lass sie nach Berlin kommen. West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt coached him on his pronunciation. Sorensen had written remarks outlining the history of the city since the onset of the Cold War, but while he was driving to the City Hall with the American commanding general, Kennedy showed him the remarks and asked the general what he thought. The general was blunt. "This is terrible, Mr. President." "I think so too," Kennedy replied. How much of the prepared remarks he planned to use is unclear. He'd scribbled his three phrases on his speaking cards, and he'd handwritten in a few other lines. But after dispensing with the introductory remarks, he pretty much ad-libbed the rest of the speech. 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum, he said. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. As the crowd bellowed its approval, he quipped, "I'd like to thank my translator. I appreciate my interpreter translating my German." It's remarkable to remember that most of that speech, which is one of the sort of stunning, memorable speeches of the Cold War, was more or less ad-libbed. The Kennedy-Sorensen relationship is often cited, and I think correctly, as a model of president-speechwriter collaboration. Ronald Reagan provides a very different model, though obviously he was also a very effective president. He understood the importance of communicating, and especially with his early speeches in his term, was deeply involved in the writing process of the speeches. As was his long custom, Reagan had had his speech printed out on 19 index cards, and now as the time to speak approached, he made final edits, marking up the speech for ease of reading. He drew lines separating each sentence, giving him easy reference points for pausing and finding his place. When a sentence ran from one card onto the next, he would complete it in neat block letters on the first card. And though he and others had been working on the speech for months, he made at least 33 last-minute changes to the cards. It was a long, ingrained process, and the fact that this was his inaugural address was no reason to change it. In his final edits on the speaking cards, Reagan cut out extraneous words, wrote in additions in careful block letters, rearranged words with tangles of arrows, changing of, by, and for the people, for example, to for, by, and of the people. Lincoln had it the first way, if anyone's wondering. His edits tightened thoughts and smoothed transitions, and it was a process that he continued as he spoke, making changes even as he delivered his inaugural address. One change was substantive. Reagan thanked Jimmy Carter for the smooth transferal of power, which he said helped maintain, quote, the continuity which is the bulwark of our republic. His speech cards had had that continuity as the hallmark of our republic. In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, Reagan said. Government is the problem. This was a rewrite on speech card number 5, which read, in this present crisis, government is not the solution, it is the problem. A line that Sarah Palin stole from Reagan last night. Reagan had campaigned on bold conservative themes, but brought moderates into the White House with him, setting up a tension between the true believers and the pragmatists. And nowhere was that tension more pronounced than between the senior staff and the speechwriters. We considered ourselves like the musketeers who were guarding the royal jewels, said speechwriter Dana Rohrbacher. The senior staff was constantly trying to browbeat us into basically putting things into the speeches that would moderate the president's position or move him in a direction other than that which he had publicly stated. You know, they called them the pragmatists versus the ideologues, as if we didn't think what we were doing could work. We were just someone who was interested in some ideology that was not attached to reality. The senior staff viewed the conservative speechwriters as a necessary nuisance. We took periodic heat from fellow centrists for harboring so many red hots. David Gergen later wrote. Gergen, of course, worked for Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Clinton, and maybe will work for Obama or McCain. The National Security Council staff and the State Department were particularly apoplectic at the prospect of Reagan saying some of the things that these writers had drafted. The speechwriters themselves were not simply ideologically, but personally quite colorful. Rohrbacher, who I've already mentioned, was a Californian who had first volunteered for Reagan in 1966 and would walk around the speechwriters' offices in cut-off jeans and flip-flops. He kept a suit and tie hanging on the back of his office door in case of an Oval Office summons. On one such occasion, he realized that he hadn't actually brought the proper footwear to the office with him, and so he had to run around the old executive office building looking for the right shoes, much to the amusement of his colleagues. They were particularly amused when he showed up at the Oval Office wearing wingtips that were several sizes too large. Rohrbacher befriended an amazing array of anti-communist fighters from places like Afghanistan and Nicaragua, whom he would bring into the White House to take to the White House mess for lunch. The amusing thing, one colleague later recalled, was watching these guys get cleared into the building because they'd have 2 knives down this sock and a bandolier and a gun. Then we'd go off to the White House mess and try to make polite conversation. You'd say something like, how are things going? He'd say, very well. Last week I personally killed 12 Soviets. Oh, would you like the tuna salad? Over the years, Reagan's many speechwriters included the former CBS radio journalist Peggy Noonan, Pat Buchanan, the former Nixon White House ghost. Another key writer was a fellow named Tony Dolan, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning former journalist and a disciple of the now late William F. Buckley. A proud Irishman and constant consumer of Partagas No. 10 cigars, Dolan was a movement conservative who viewed communism in the same deeply moralistic, philosophical terms that Reagan employed. When Reagan spoke at Westminster in June 1982, Dolan was the principal speechwriter, despite the wishes of the more moderate senior staffers. Reagan did his usual editing job, tightening, crossing out whole paragraphs, inserting pages in his own hand. He eliminated references to the Soviet Union as a militaristic empire and an evil episode in history. His moderate advisors toned down other red-hot rhetoric. Reagan had retained the assertion that in the supremacy of the state lay, quote, the focus of evil, unquote, in the world. But it was expunged before the president delivered the address at Westminster. The NSC staffers were appalled by the tone of Tony Dolan's draft. They pleaded with him to change the speech. Do what we want, one NSC staffer said, and together we will leave the Soviet Union on the ash heap of history. Oh, Dolan said, that's an interesting phrase. Can you say it again? He inserted into the next draft of the speech a line about democracy leaving Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history, and he described it as a National Security Council insert. The speech was a rhetorical and philosophical high point for Reagan. He talked about how there was a great economic crisis, but it was on the part of the communists, not the part of the free world, and how the end of the Soviet Union was inevitable. He talked about a plan and a hope for the long term, the march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. Soviet says crusade by Reagan may risk global catastrophe, the New York Times reported the next day. Time magazine added, it was a bad week for relations between Moscow and Washington. Reading the, quote, indignant cables from Moscow, unquote, Dolan recalled, I can assure you we were giggling like schoolboys. Dolan was again the speechwriter the following spring when Reagan addressed the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida. He borrowed from his early drafts of the Westminster speech. Back came the Soviet Union as, quote, the focus of evil in the modern world. Back came a lengthy quotation from the C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters about how the greatest evil in the world is done by cold, quiet bureaucrats who never have to raise their voice. Back came references to communism as, quote, sad and, quote, bizarre, a, quote, chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. And most importantly, back came the empire concept, couched this time in terms that were more arch. The nuclear freeze movement, the speech said, incorrectly labeled both sides in the Cold War equally at fault, ignoring, quote, the fact of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. The senior staff kept sending the speech back to Dolan with the evil empire section crossed out, and he kept putting it back in. And eventually the senior staff decided, you know what, it's the kind of thing Reagan would say, and in the National Association of Evangelicals, it's a B-list speech, no one's going to pay attention to it, it'll be fine. The speech delivered on March 8th drew numerous cheering interruptions, and it quickly garnered national attention. The New York Times gave it front-page coverage under the headline, Reagan denounces ideology of Soviet as, quote, focus of evil, unquote. This wasn't merely good luck. Dolan had called the New York Times reporter the night before and told him what was coming. It's striking that virtually all of President Reagan's best-remembered lines, whether it's these are the boys at Pointe du Hoc, tear down this wall, even win one for the Gipper, there was always a struggle going on backstage between the conservatives, predominantly the speechwriters, and the senior staff over whether Reagan should actually, whether these phrases should actually go into his speeches. This gulf between speechwriters and policymakers wasn't present, of course, in the days of, for example, JFK and Ted Sorensen. Then the president's speechwriter was also his top policy aide. But it was a gulf that had grown since the days of Nixon and really became largest under Reagan and especially George H.W. Bush. But things started to swing back under the two most recent administrations. And speechwriters and policymakers tend to work more closely together, and there's less of a distinction between them. But Clinton and his speechwriters had other problems. Clinton's speech style, for Clinton, speeches were often a dialogue. He could read a crowd and adjust accordingly, seamlessly departing and returning to his prepared text. The analogy most Clinton speechwriters used was jazz musician. The job of the speechwriter, as one recalled, was to try to establish the main theme and give him the freedom to riff. Clinton, of course, the speechwriters would find this frustrating, that they would work so hard on a speech, and then Clinton would toss out half of it and make up stuff as he went along. And even Clinton understood that this could be frustrating for them. He told his last chief speechwriter that it was just his style, that he even did it with speeches that he'd written himself. It's when he gets up there, he sees people he knows, stories come to his mind, connections are being made, and he's off. So he's doing his own thing. He uses the speech. He knows the policy nugget that's in there. He studies it. He makes sure he gets it out there, but he does it in his own style. Clinton's speechwriters would eventually learn to boldface in the text the really important part that he couldn't skip. And he would usually get it in unless it was some really a phrase that was either too rhetorical, because Clinton didn't like flowery rhetoric, or if it was too banal. One of his speechwriters called this "that's the way the cookie falls apart" syndrome. Because that's what Clinton would say if she would put in "that's how the cookie crumbles." Like Carter before him, Clinton had not worked with speechwriters before running for president. Carter never became comfortable with speechwriters, but Clinton and his senior staff, especially after the 1994 congressional victories by the Republicans, learned to use the bully pulpit broadly and speechwriters more specifically. But as we recall, the early days of the Clinton administration were quite chaotic. Take his first foreign policy address in February of 1993. Clinton was supposed to address American University, talking about how to deal with the Soviet Union in a post-Cold... I think I'm mixing up my stories. In any case, Clinton was supposed to speak at American University. Speechwriter Jeremy Rosner gathered with other aides in the Oval Office. Things, of course, were running late. Clinton was not working from the most recent draft of the speech, so Rosner had to give him pages from the current version. The two drafts got jumbled. Rosner was panicking. During the campaign, he'd never worked with Clinton one-on-one. Then an aide told Clinton that it was time to leave for American University. "Come on, Jeremy," Clinton said. "Get in the limousine." The motorcade wound along the Rock Creek Parkway. Pages from the two drafts, covered with Clinton's scribble, were everywhere. The president, eyeglasses down on his nose, was editing. What was that line we wanted to add? We should move the section over here. Which page is this draft from? Rosner answered while holding the president's coffee cup as the car traveled the well-worn February road. Oh my God, he thought, the speech is screwed up. We're about to hit a pothole, and I'm going to spill coffee over the president. I'm going to lose my job. Even if he avoided scolding the president, he was sure the speech was doomed. Clinton hadn't even engaged in the substance yet, which was still all over the place. Rosner managed to avoid spilling the coffee, but watched with trepidation as Clinton grabbed the stack of papers, walked up to the podium, told an anecdote about how when he was a Georgetown student, he dated an AU girl. Then he launched into the speech. It was perfect, Rosner recalled. He ad-libbed some sections, he found key paragraphs, and it was this gorgeous speech, much better than anything we had written. So Rosner felt more comfortable in April when Clinton gave his next foreign policy address. And the same process unfolded. Again, the same process unfolded. Clinton was scheduled to speak to lunch with midshipmen at the U.S. Naval Academy, and then was going to speak on how to deal with the Soviets in a post-Cold War world to the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Again, Rosner ended up in the presidential limousine, going over last-minute changes. This time, National Security Advisor Anthony Lake was in the limousine as well. This time, Clinton held his own coffee cup, clutching it in his teeth as he edited the speech. Then the car hit a bump. Coffee spilled down the front of Clinton's shirt. "Oh man," he yelled, "what am I going to do? This is my first visit to a military academy. My shirt is ruined." He instructed the Secret Service to divert the motorcade into Annapolis so he could go to a department store and get a new shirt. The Secret Service told him this was not going to happen. So Lake offered Clinton the shirt off his back, but was several sizes smaller than Clinton. Finally, the Secret Service had to radio up and down the motorcade until they found a Secret Service agent who was Clinton's size, and at a hastily arranged stop, went in and gave the president the shirt off his back. I could go on. There are so many stories in White House Ghosts that are either entertaining or illustrative or both. But I think I've already broken the cardinal rule of presidential speeches, which is brevity. So what I'd like to do now is open up the floor to questions. If you have any questions about these are other presidents, these are other White House ghosts, or anything. So thank you all very much.
Floor is now open for questions.
I had a question about two genres that are on either side, I think, of presidential speeches. One is presidential books, and the other is debates. Is there serious speech writing involvement with either one of those?
Most presidential and political books, I think, tend to be wholly ghost-written. It's actually interesting because McCain and Obama are both authors, but in this case, certainly I believe Obama is supposed to have written his books himself. McCain has his speechwriter was his principal co-author, the guy named Mark Salter, who's known McCain for a very long time, been a very close aide. And so it's presumed that this was not McCain's books are not simply a case of let's rip off let's dash off a policy thing and because I'm going to run for president. But this is actually a serious book. So it's one of those rare cases where everyone who runs for president writes a book, but this is one of the rare instances where they actually the two candidates, if they didn't sit down and write it themselves, in McCain's case, certainly they had deep involvement in it. With debate preparation, it depends on administration to administration whether the speechwriter would be involved. Presidents, any politician who goes in front of a debate has the questions, has prepared for a wide variety of questions and answers, gives their sort of pre-programmed answer, and the best ones can make it seem like they're actually listening to the question and answering it. And if you do any kind of media training, you're told don't answer the question that was asked. Answer the question that you wish it would have been asked. And there were some good examples of that last night. It actually reminds me of it's not debate prep, but one of my favorite stories that didn't end up making it into the final draft of the book came from Pat Buchanan, who was a Nixon speechwriter, and among his other duties, he was the person who would prepare the briefing book for Nixon when Nixon would give press conferences. And this would be the book with all of they'd sit around and think of any possible question the president could be asked by the press, put it in the book. After one of these press conferences, Nixon calls Buchanan or sends him a note and says, "You did a wonderful job with the briefing book. You anticipated all the questions that were asked, but you had a lot of questions in the briefing book that weren't asked. So could you leave those out next time?" Other questions?
This one's got to be asked. Who's been responsible for GW's rhetoric?
Well, again, the three guys that I mentioned at the top, Gerson, McConnell, and Scully, his first term at least, were virtually every speech he gave, whether it was what's called Rose Garden rubbish when the president goes and welcomes a Little League team to the Rose Garden, or up to the State of the Union, everything would go through these three guys. And so either they would sit together and write it together, or another member of the speechwriting staff would do a draft, and the three of them would edit it. It's interesting because they got along very well and were great friends and loved working together and talked about how they loved coming to work together. But the problem was that only the one guy, Michael Gerson, who is now a columnist at the Washington Post, is at the Council on Foreign Relations, would get all the publicity. And you'd see these articles in the newspaper about Michael Gerson, the lone genius who goes to Starbucks and scribbles on a yellow legal pad and is coming up with all the president's flowery rhetoric. And the other two guys are sitting there like, we're here too. And one of the other guys, Matthew Scully, after he left the administration a couple of years ago, wrote a scathing article in the Atlantic Monthly, sort of laying bare the grievances and saying, no, Michael Gerson is not the lone genius laboring to supply words to the president. It was a collaborative thing, and he's a self-promoter. Scully now is a speechwriter for John McCain, and was the speechwriter who worked with Palin on her acceptance address. The third fellow John McConnell, who's actually technically Vice President Cheney's speechwriter, make of that what you will, is actually still at the White House and is going to be one of those rare people that will be a staffer in administration from day one to all the way to the end.
All right, I had two questions. The first one has to deal with when you're talking about Reagan's note cards. Just wondering how the role of teleprompters in today's speeches and how that affects speech writing and speech making. And then the second one is just wondering if you can elaborate on maybe Abraham Lincoln's speech process.
I'll do the second one first because I don't know the answer. I touched on it very briefly in the introduction. I know that Lincoln, obviously, I think our most eloquent and skilled with words president. He probably wouldn't say something like skilled with words president. And he would occasionally go for, get help from people. The famous phrase from his first inaugural address, he went to William Seward, his incoming Secretary of State, and asked for some suggestions. And Seward wrote a few lines, including, quote, the hope that, quote, the mystic chords which, proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves, pass through all the hearts and hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. Lincoln, of course, took this and turned it into the mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as they surely will be, by the better angels of our nature. And so that's a great example of a very skilled president taking a good paragraph and just polishing it into a historical phrase, a historical paragraph. On the question of teleprompters, Harry Truman went to one of his staffers one day and said, I've heard about this machine they've got where they have the speech scroll in front of you. What do you think? And the aide sort of interested, and Truman eventually decided he wasn't interested. Eisenhower was the first president to use a teleprompter and hated it. And a lot of politicians have a real problem with it. And part of the reason Eisenhower hated it, one was that it kept malfunctioning whenever he would use it. But also, he found he thought it'd be okay if you could actually control the speed at which the teleprompter sped the text by, but you couldn't, and so you'd be kind of bound to the text. There are, of course, famous examples of other teleprompter malfunctions, the best known being Bill Clinton in 1993, when in the fall of 1993 he was supposed to give his health care address to the Congress pitching his health care plan, and he gets up there and looks down at the teleprompter, and his State of the Union address from 8 months before is in there. And so Clinton just wings it. And during the first applause break, Gore is sitting behind him. He turns to Gore and says, the teleprompter's broken, get it fixed. And Gore scurries away, and after 5 or 10 minutes, the proper speech pops on and catches up. But Clinton had just gotten up and, been Bill Clinton. Hewitt's a conservative talk show host, isn't he? Yeah. There are a lot of people who take credit for having been presidential speechwriters, and the process is convoluted enough that occasionally their claim might have credibility. I have no idea. I never came across Hewitt, so if he might have contributed to a Reagan speech at some point, but he would not be one that you would call sort of among the roster of the Reagan presidential speechwriters. Noonan was fascinating because she was such a striking figure, both in terms of everyone described her as being a real looker, but also she has very little use for foolishness, and she would chafe under the process that had grown up in the speech writing, where half the job of a speechwriter these days is to write the speech. The other half is to get the speech to the president in something resembling intact, because the speechwriter writes the speech and then it goes out to the bureaucracy, and everyone wants to weigh in, and everyone fancies it themselves. Oh, I can be a writer. This is my chance to be a presidential speechwriter, and so they send in changes and say this instead of that, and take this out instead of that. And sometimes it would be the stuff that I described of the moderates saying, you can't have Reagan say this, and sometimes it would just be inanity. And so Noonan, in her wonderful book, What I Saw at the Revolution, talks about some of this stuff, and including arguments about what exactly to say in the Boys of Pontotoc speech, whether to say the boom of the cannons or the roar of the cannons, whether to include make reference to the Russian dead in the Second World War. Noonan was a very elegant speechwriter, and she would tend to write the speeches that she was involved with are the ones that are remembered for their lofty rhetoric. These are the Boys of Pontotoc. The Shuttle Challenger speech. She was the person who got that assignment. And I'm looking for the account of that. She writes the speech, and she remembers the John Magee poem "High Flight" with the line about having slipped its early bonds of earth to touch the face of God, and she sends it in, and they have a conference as to what to include in as to whatever final changes. And one of the NFC staffers, in what Noonan described as the worst attempt to rewrite a speech that she encountered in the White House, tried to have it read that the astronauts had slipped the early bonds of earth to reach out and touch someone. I'm not even making this up. To reach out and touch someone, touch the face of God. and happily they managed to not let that in, but...
On the series West Wing, the speechwriters have an active role in policy making. And what you described is speechwriters being on the receiving end to a certain extent of policy decisions, but I didn't get the sense that they've actually been engaged in deciding what the policy should be. Can you comment on how accurate the West Wing is in that regard?
It depends on the presidency, because as I said, certainly FDR through Kennedy, the speechwriters were the senior policy aides. So there was no, Ted Sorensen was JFK's top policy aide. Johnson, his major speeches were written by people like Jack Valenti and Joe Califano and Bill Moyers, who were, again, his top policy aides. And so there'd be no struggle between the policy aides and speechwriters because they were the speechwriters. Now, under Johnson, Johnson was doing so much that the top policy aides didn't have time to write all the speeches, especially when it was just Johnson going out to announce his latest initiative in the Rose Garden. So they actually hired people who were full-time speechwriters, and this is the first sort of separation. And this separation grew under successive presidents to the point I described under Reagan and especially Bush 41, where there'd be these great fights. And under Bush 41, the first President Bush had a sort of, I suppose, admirable but unrealistic assumption that his actions would speak for themselves, and he wouldn't have to worry about speechifying too much because, he would be an action person, not a talk person. And that's a nice thought, but as a practical matter, it's not a realistic view of the modern presidency. But his speechwriters were often in the old executive office building and didn't actually have West Wing passes. So they'd have like an office one that they'd have to share. And so sometimes they'd be late for meetings with the president because they couldn't actually get into the White House. And then under Clinton and even under the current President Bush, it swung back more, where under Clinton you'd have the speechwriter and the policy guy and a couple of speechwriters and a policy guy sitting together, hammering out phrases and writing a speech together. And you had speechwriters who would go on to become policy guys, or policy guys who would become head speechwriters. And then under Bush, Gerson, who was the chief speechwriter in the first term, had a policy portfolio and had the juice to be in policy discussions and push back and say, no, we shouldn't put it this way, we should do it that way. And unlike other administrations where the speechwriters are fairly powerless, the speechwriters under the current president could say, no, the president wouldn't say this, we're not going to put this in. And occasionally they'd leave in offending phrases because they would know that Bush would say, John McConnell didn't write this. Or who in this room is the person who wrote this little piece of garbage here? Typical of Bush.
You said that Obama wrote a lot of his speeches himself. Is this an unusual thing?
Well, Obama has speechwriters. He, as of the start of the campaign, had 3 speechwriters, one of whom was actually a former assistant to Ted Sorensen. So there's sort of a generational Democratic thing going on there. He is supposed to be very engaged in the speechwriting process and does a lot of work on speeches and works closely with the speechwriters. He is reported to have written his speech on race himself. And again, I think every president, to some extent, is involved, especially in the major speeches. I mean, there's sort of a conception that speechwriters are like scriptwriters or something. It's like, all right, here are your lines, and they go out and give a speech. I think the thing with Obama is he obviously gets the importance of speech making and how critical that can be for a president. It's the extent to which he gets that's one tool of many, and that it's not. You can't keep going to the fastball. You need to be able to throw a changeup and a curve, if I can use a sports metaphor. Well, let's go here, and then I'll go.
She asked something that was kind of related to my question, but I was wondering, I think one of the things that comes evident in listening to you is that the president's governing style can kind of be seen through his speechwriting style. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what we know about McCain and Obama's speechwriting style and if that can shed light on the types of presidents that they would be in the future.
Well, with Obama, as I said, obviously he gets the importance of public communications, and that's his great strength. And the question with him is, as I said, the extent to which he has skills and is able to use them in the other parts of presidential power, and whether whether as president he would be able to how skillfully he'd be able to use the other parts of it and know when to give a presidential speech, because the context, the rest of the political context has to be correct in order for that to work. In terms of McCain, he has a very long relationship with his principal speechwriter, and I've been sort of mystified throughout the whole campaign at their inability to find a style that suits him and lets him be effective. Harry Truman couldn't give a speech, couldn't deliver a prepared speech. He would bend way over and then look up at the audience and lose his place, and he would kind of speak in a nasal monotone. And it was terrible. And his speechwriters, his top aides, in 48, they would sit around and say, he's so engaging in private. How do we get this Truman out to the public? And they hit upon the notion of just giving him talking points. Here are the 5 things you need to hit. Here's an outline. Go talk. And not tied to a text. Truman was engaging. He was energetic. He would vary his pacing and speaking. And this was the secret of one of the secrets of the 48 comeback campaign, was the train would pull into the station, and his aides would hand him a sheet with the details of the local town, 1 or 2 things to say, and he would just go out and talk. And the crowd loved it, and the press thought it was great because Truman's opponent, Dewey, would get up and give the same bland speech every time, which is what politicians do now. And Truman would get up and you weren't sure what he was going to say. And by the end of the day, he'd have covered every issue on the waterfront, and they'd have great stories. I've thought for months now that the McCain staff needs to figure out how to have that intellectual leap with McCain and figure out, all right, how do we get him in a position to be his best speaking self? It seems to me that he doesn't put the value into public speaking that Obama does. And again, it reminds me of George H.W. Bush. It reminds me of Jimmy Carter. It reminds me of Gerald Ford. None of these were presidents who were either willing or able to use the bully pulpit effectively, and we all know how their presidencies turned out.
I wonder if you could comment briefly about the process of researching and writing this book. Sources you had access to, sources you may not have had access to, and the judgments you've had to make between sometimes competing accounts of what actually happened, who said what, and why.
That's a great question. It was the very short answer is that I interviewed more than 90 current and former presidential speechwriters and other top aides. I interviewed at least one person from every administration I covered. So there's one guy in Washington who worked for one of Roosevelt's speechwriters who's still around. And so it's very cool to, like, this guy was in the room with Roosevelt. I visited all of the presidential libraries except for Clinton's, because the Clinton speechwriting papers haven't been released yet. I am number 50-something on a list of Freedom of Information Act requests that they're plowing through, and I expect that maybe by the 4th edition of this book I'll have access to the Clinton papers. And then I read every book that I could get my hands on, either by or about current and former presidential speechwriters. What I found especially fascinating was the technological changes. When my father was working on his Roosevelt books 50 years ago, he would go to the Roosevelt Library and he would get files out and he would copy by hand interesting memorandums or notes or letters or what have you. And if he needed to know what the newspapers at the time were saying, he would have to go to you'd have to go to the library and pull out the microfiche and scroll through the microfiche and see what the papers had said, and probably have to take hand notes of that. And if you wanted to know exactly what a president had said, he'd have to go get the public papers of the president and flip through the speeches and read the speech. I would go to the presidential libraries, get the files out. If there was a document that I found interesting, I would pull out my my camera and I would take a picture of it. I felt like a spy or something. And I don't actually know what I was thinking, because this is something I went to the first library, I went to the Reagan Library, and they said you can take pictures in your camera. This is the greatest thing I've heard of. And I don't know what I was thinking, because it costs like 20 cents a page to make a copy, and paper stacks up. And I ended up with about 30,000 pages of documents from the various libraries, and I don't know how I expected to pay for it or where I expected to keep it. When I wanted to know how something was covered, I subscribe to the New York Times, so I have access online to the New York Times' full archive. Time Magazine's full archive is free searchable online. Virtually every newspaper, one way or another, if you have to pay $1 for the story or not, are searchable online. There was a book I'd heard of that I hadn't gotten to yet. You can go to Google Books or Amazon.com and do text searches of a lot of books. And there are some books that I said that I never actually had in my hand because I just found it on Google Books, and now here's what I need, and bang, right in there. The public papers of the presidents are searchable online. So, and I'll wrap up with this. If you remember in 2007, when the Democrats took over Congress and Bush gave his first State of the Union address to a democratically controlled Congress, he got up and made a reference to the Democrat Congress, or the Democrat-controlled Congress. And there was a big kerfuffle because Democrat is a descriptive that Republicans use because they found that it grates on the ears, Democrat as opposed to Democratic. And it makes Democrats crazy. And so when Bush got up and said the Democrat Congress, all the Democrats kind of wigged out and were like, he's disrespecting us, and this is a shot at us. And I thought, who's the first president who did that? So I did a search of the public papers of the president and found that Dwight Eisenhower was the first president to use that descriptive. And I did a search of the New York Times and Time Magazine and found that at the time it had actually been a big deal because a year earlier, the RNC had started saying Democrat Congress or whatever, and Eisenhower had said, "I don't care. They can call themselves whatever they want." And then the next year had actually said it because the RNC chairman had really kind of not bullied him, but kind of begged and pleaded him to do it. And so it was a little minor big deal at the time. And it was one of those things that I could never have done it 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago probably, because I wasn't going to sit there and plow through every paper of the presidency and see who the first president to do it was. So thank you all very much for coming.